Hello everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our second webinar at Future Proof. So my name is Emily Stewart, and I'll be hosting for the first 20 or so minutes of this webinar. Then I'm going to run off to class, unfortunately. Don't mind that I'm horribly backlit in this university study room right now, but hopefully you can see and hear me okay. So today, of course, we have Rachel Amery from the Scotsman, political correspondent from the Scotsman. We're going to be talking to her a little bit about journalism, misinformation, and the upcoming Scottish elections. So if you have any questions today, be sure to pop them in the chat, and we'll try and get through to as many as possible. Yeah, hello, Rachel. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
And we'll just get off by really asking you what you do in your day to day. What's your kind of job like, and what, what's life as a political correspondent like?
Yeah, so normally I am based at Holyrood. In Holyrood, there's a media tower, and all the newspapers have a wee cubby hole room almost, if you want to put it that way. So normally I'm in there talking to politicians and writing stories about what's happening in politics. But it is a little bit different right now because it's the election and Parliament is dissolved. So at the moment, we're kind of out and about all the time, following the party leaders around, trying to see what they're doing, trying to get interviews with them. And been all over. I've been to Inverness, been Dundee, Edinburgh yesterday. At the beginning of the week, I was in a couple of days in Aberdeen. So it's been really good to actually just get out and about and really sort of see different parts of the country. That's been really good fun. So mostly just trying to do pieces on what's happening each day in the election. I've also been writing stories that are a bit more evergreen, so trying to explain how the voting system works, for example. And another, I've got a story this weekend going in about the smaller parties that are standing for election that people might not know about. And we've all heard of like Labour, Conservatives, SNP, we all know those parties, but there's so many small niche parties as well. So that piece is going out at the weekend. So things like that too, I've been doing. Also separately, I do sort of freelance work as like a commentator on on STV and BBC. And obviously that's kind of ramped up at the moment as well because of the election. So occasionally I'll go and do sort of commentating, I suppose, on programs, political programs at the STV and things like that too.
Fantastic. And would you say that your journalism and journalism more broadly in Scotland right now plays quite a big role in countering misinformation during election campaigns? Are you seeing a lot of that right now?
Yeah, I mean, this is it's been a sort of a growing issue for a number of years, misinformation, and I think sort of particularly in the past few years, this election in particular, that is something we need to look out for. We know that there has been in recent years sort of um, issues with independence messaging, whether it's on both sides. It's come from like sort of international actors, for example, and trying to see if they are basically who's behind them all and who's sort of controlling these accounts. So we know this has been an issue for a few years that has directly related to Scottish politics. I think sometimes it's quite easy to sort of sit back like, oh, it's just Scotland, though, it's fine. We don't have problems with all these international sort of things going on, but actually, yes, there is actually sort of malicious threats sort of going on when it comes to Scottish politics there. When it comes to misinformation, that's a big issue at the moment as well. And that's when you sort of come towards the more sort of trusted news brands, if you want to say. Of course, I'm going to say that news brands are more trustworthy here, but there is so much that has to go into a piece of work before it gets published. I think a lot of people out there just assume that we just type whatever we want and press publish and it goes out into the internet and that's it off. And I think people get surprised when you realise that you've got to have a certain number of sources, you've got to sometimes have to go through a legal person before it gets printed. It has to go through a number of editors for proofreading before it goes out onto the internet or into print as well. And I think people don't realise how many steps there actually are before something goes on the internet or goes into the newspaper. And then that's sort of the steps, and I suppose the safeguarding, if you want to use that word, that newspapers and sort of trusted broadcasters use that a lot of others perhaps don't. And so I think if people understood a bit more about just how much goes into a piece of work in terms of the steps before it gets published, that would be really helpful, I think, because there is a very much a big distrust amongst sort of the mainstream media. And there has been for a number of years. I mean, I remember when I was at journalism school, I'm pretty sure the least trusted profession was politicians, and the second least trusted profession was journalists. So being a political journalist, it's like people already don't trust the journalists and don't trust the politicians that you're writing about. And that's been the case for years now. And so that's why I think it's really important that people understand there is a reason to go back towards these sort of trusted news brands that you know and understand, because there is so many steps that go into it. There are so many legal things that we have to keep to. There's the editor's code of conduct that we need to stick to as well. And all of that does help tackle misinformation and disinformation. And we have seen that already in this election campaign. And I'm sure we'll talk about this a wee bit more about the recent Channel 4 debate. And we saw Malcolm Offord from Reform UK and Anna Sauer from Scottish Labour accusing each other of this, that, and the next thing about deals behind closed doors. We don't know who's telling the truth there or what the truth is, but what we can say is at least one of them is lying. So we're already seeing that misinformation and that sort of like who do you trust? Who is telling the truth? Who is lying? We're already seeing that very much playing out on the election campaign.
And you're saying about people kind of not realizing how much work goes in behind pieces of work, pieces of political work and political journalism. Do you think that's part of the reason why so many people turn to social media, is that they feel like it's almost on an even playing field of information?
Yeah, and I suppose as well, because newspapers and broadcasters are using social media as a platform themselves to put out their content, that again is probably where that sort of blurred line comes in as to what you see on social media. I think as well, back in the day, you'd have people going into the shop to buy the newspaper that they read, the same newspaper every day. That was their brand, that was what they stuck to. That's not necessarily the case anymore. Readers are not necessarily all that loyal. It tends to be more what grabs you when you read it on social media. What's the headline that grabs you? Is it a story that you're interested in? And so therefore, a lot of the time, I don't even know if people are really taking in who has written the story, what news outlet it is. It's more just, are they interested in that story? Are they interested in that headline? So it's not so much of a case of, oh, I know who that journalist is, I trust them, or oh, I know that's my go-to newspaper, I trust them. It's, you will read multiple stories from multiple different newspapers a day rather than just sitting down to one newspaper that you've bought. So that kind of thing blurs the lines as well, because you're just clicking on headlines because that's what you want to read, and you're then just immediately consuming the content. I hate the phrase content for journalism, but that's what we have to sort of think about these days. And so because of that, I think that sort of blurs the lines there a little bit when it comes to social media, particularly because we're now trying to post more reels on social media, for example, and trying to use Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, X. We're trying to use a whole range of them. I think that all contributes to that.
Do you feel that perhaps there is a bit of a push to go back to physical media and to have trust in institutional journalism again? Because obviously at the moment, most people get their news from social media, but during 2020, during the COVID pandemic, many people turned back to traditional journalism. And we've seen a kind of wave of people, particularly in my generation, that have kind of tried to go kind of the future of for example, your job going and these other kind of political journalism jobs that are tied to papers and online articles. How do you see that developing? And would you say that it is going fully, social media potential?
Yeah, I think that is definitely the future. I think journalism as a profession, I mean, this is years before I became a journalist, but I think when the advent of social media, journalism wasn't perhaps quick enough to really get on board with it and utilize it, which is why we're now sort of on the back foot when it comes to social media. I suppose you're seeing the same thing just now with AI. There is an answer. I don't know what the answer is because I'm not clever enough at that sort of thing, but there is an answer now for journalism to work with AI, so that the same thing that happened with social media doesn't happen again with AI. So that's there. In terms of going back to sort of physical media, the sort of the age of buying newspapers is over. It has been over for a very long time, and we're seeing that even just how we have to present our work. So we're always thinking of our stories going to be read on a mobile phone. So how does it look on a mobile phone? We're not thinking about how does it look in a newspaper page. So it's always like how easy is it for someone to scroll through your story? How much sort of video and picture content do you need on it as well? Because we know that's how people are reading their stories now. They're not reading it in a newspaper, they're reading it on a phone. And then that then also changes how you charge people for your journalism as well, which again comes back to the whole debate of journalism wasn't quick enough to get on board with social media, because we're now most papers are working towards a subscription based model where you buy a subscription online that gets you access to the website. Um, it's probably the best model at the moment going forward. The problem is because people have had journalism for free online and social media for so long, trying to get people to sort of shift that sort of mindset is really, really difficult. It's getting there very, very slowly. But when you've had journalism for free online for so long, it's very hard to make people make that shift. And I even know my friends, for example, they'll ask about something I'm doing at work, and I'm like, "Oh yeah, here's my article. You can read it." And like, "Oh, I can't read that. It's behind a paywall." Or you see people commenting on like community groups on Facebook. It's like, "Oh, it's ridiculous. It's behind a paywall." I'm like, "Yeah, it needs to be though, because otherwise journalism will die out." So you are seeing that sort of change there, between moving towards a digital first audience rather than a print first audience. But you're talking there about trust in sort of the traditional media. I'm actually going to get my emails up in front of me because it's a really interesting email I got earlier today. Now, I doubt this will actually make any stories, to be honest, tomorrow, but I stand to be corrected. After the back of this fallout between Malcolm Offord and Anna Sarwar at the Channel 4 debate, my colleague David Ball wrote a story about this. There was then accusations on debate night from Labour that that was perhaps what he wrote wasn't true. He then put on X that he's not very happy because the Labour candidate has suggested that he is a liar for what he's reported and his party strategists are. So it's quite interesting that my colleague had to sort of post on social media saying, "Look, I'm not a liar. I've been accused of being a liar, and that's not what happened here." And I've now had a press release from the SNP this morning, basically highlighting this and having a go at Labour because of this. So it's quite interesting that we're here to talk about misinformation and disinformation in this election, when just this very morning, my colleague had put on social media that he'd been accused of lying, and then political parties put out a press release on the back of that. Like I said, I doubt that will make any stories tomorrow in the newspapers, but that's quite interesting that happened just this morning.
Yeah, it just shows how kind of commonplace this is potentially becoming now. And on this, do you think that the audience, that Scottish voters and the voter base in Scotland is becoming less or more resilient to this type of thing? Is there a sort of exhaustion from kind of this amount of misinformation and disinformation online now? Are people kind of maybe disengaging from news online in some way?
I know just personally, there's a lot of people I know are deliberately turning off of news. They don't want to read it, they don't want to see it, they don't want to click on it, they don't have any engagement with it. And they do sort of try and curate their social media feeds so that they don't see it. I know for myself, for example, on my threads feed is just books. I don't want to touch anything, I don't want to like anything, I don't want to follow anything, I don't want to change the algorithm because it works nicely. But I know that there are people who are deliberately trying to do sort of things like that so that they don't read news, they don't see news, for example. So that, of course, has an impact. But I think what's interesting about this election is there's a huge chunk of people at this election who are either not going to vote, aren't sure if they're going to vote, or don't know who to vote for. They're still undecided. There's also a scary amount of people who don't even know there's an election happening in less than 3 weeks' time, and that it's quite an important election. And I think a big chunk of that is because people have turned off from news. People are so annoyed and angry at the state of politics and are so unhappy with how things have been, I suppose, since the sort of the onset of the COVID pandemic, I suppose, as well. All those things have sort of contributed to the fact that there is now all this people who just don't want to engage with the election. I think that does extend across to journalism as well. And anecdotally, yeah, we do know people who just genuinely don't want to see the news. They don't want to hear about it because it's always very sad and depressing, isn't it? So, and there's also the sort of the echo chamber effect as well, where if there is a story that starts to do well, starts to rack up views, the editors see that, want more stories on it. And if it's a bad news story or a depressing news story, then more and more and more content will be pumped out because people know it's what people want to read. And so there is an echo chamber effect there coming in too.
Can I just jump on that?
Yeah.
I'm Rabi. I'm with the Future Proof team as well. You were saying that you don't think there's a lot of people who don't even know that there's an election on, and a lot of people who are disengaged with it. I was wondering if you thought at all that the the Americanization or the Anglicizing factor of social media plays a role, just in terms of, say, most of my social media feed is very American, and it focuses on American issues like the obsession with Trump, which is obviously important for global politics, but I worry that there's been a turning away from almost local news. And I know it sounds weird thinking of the Scotsman as a local paper, but it's almost becoming that way. And in terms of the issues that people are raising coming up to this election, a lot of them seem to be out with the remit of the actual Scottish Parliament and the Scottish government and the point of having Scottish elections. So I just wondered if at the Scotsman you're sort of worried at all about that actual lack of interest in what's going on in Scotland.
Yeah, there's two things that I've just maybe think of just when you said that there. The first one again would be the Channel 4 debate on Tuesday night, and I think the first question was about Donald Trump and things like that, and that was a good chunk of the debate was taken up by that, and it's just really interesting because things like foreign relations are not within the remit of the Scottish Parliament, and it's not really what this election is about, and yet that's what that debate started off with. Now I understand that there's a UK
Same
audience. Yeah,
same with
there's a UK
immigration and oil and
audience.
gas. Yeah,
Yeah, exactly. So there is a UK audience for the Channel 4 debate, which there wasn't for the BBC debate. But that being said, there is still it's quite interesting that that's what they chose to focus on rather than other issues. So we know that across the whole country, it doesn't matter which constituency you're in, which region you're in, the top priority for voters is the NHS. And it was interesting that that wasn't touched on at all in this election, in that debate. So that's quite interesting. The other thing that I thought was quite interesting when you raised that there, Monday night, I was at the Reform UK rally in Aberdeen at the P&G Live on Monday night. And it was very sort of Americanized, if that makes sense. It was clearly made for a streaming audience. It was clearly sort of taking inspiration from how American politics is done. And just the way it was presented and the way people were on stage and the way they were dressed and speaking to the audience, it did feel very, very American. And I thought that was quite interesting because it was very different from what we've seen before in Scottish politics. When it comes to what do we focus on, I think there is more of a focus on try and be as Scottish focused as you possibly can. Even for example, if there's a UK politics story, if we can't bring it back to Scotland, then we really are struggling to wonder why we write it. So we really are trying to focus more on can we get it back to Scotland because we know that that's what the audience want. Before I had this job, I worked at the Courier and the Press and Journal, two regional newspapers, um, and they were even more so try and get as focused as possible to the smaller geographical area. So even a sort of a national Scottish politics news story, I know that the journalists who work at DC Thompson now, if they can't get that Scottish politics story to fit to that Tayside or Aberdeenshire audience, then they don't look to it because they know that the audience wants that local connection there. So I think there is more of a focus now within journalism to try and get that to as close as possible. Um, and talking
do
to
you
Channel 4
think?
sorry, carry on.
Well, I'm just worried that social media runs counterintuitive to that. So most
Mhm.
people my age, based on recent studies, get most of their news from social media. And I know myself that most of the news I get on social media is news about London, or it's news about the
Mm.
United States. So I just worry that not that it's a losing battle, but that you've kind of got to meet it on its own turf. You've really got to target
Yeah,
social
and
media
that's
and get
really
young Scots interested in Scottish politics.
yeah, and that's probably on us to try and get better at search engine optimization and sort of trying to be the sort of the shop front to our content. And again, I hate the word content, but I suppose that's on us then to try and do better then because that is obviously worrying, and that's the fault of us for not doing it well enough, and because the algorithms change so often as well. It is you are constantly playing catch up because it feels like once you've mastered one set of algorithms, they change it. So that it does, yeah, it is a bit kind of like that, but the focus is definitely on trying to keep it as local to Scotland as possible. And I know there's quite a few papers trying to do the same thing.
Do you have any questions, Tom? You just joined the call.
Yeah, hi. Sorry, I was just looking at the questions, trying to find the best one to ask. For a first-time voter, it's just Scottish politics can sometimes feel like joining a TV show that's already 17 seasons, 17 series in, if that makes sense. I was just wondering what's important for people, for first-time voters to know going into this election, and what could they maybe not have to look too in depth about?
Yeah, I think the big thing is because we know so many people are not going to be voting or don't want to vote. Um, I think this I would just try and encourage everyone to make sure they do vote, and also that we know that there's a lot of people who don't realise they can vote, for example. So, for example, 16, 17-year-olds can vote in a Scottish election. Foreign nationals who are living in Scotland, a lot of them are actually eligible to vote as well. So there's a lot of people who don't realise they actually can vote. And there's still, I think, 3 days to register to vote. So I think the biggest thing I would say to young voters is make sure you do get out to vote because it is really, really important. When it comes to a lot of places are going through manifestos and trying to break it down to small, sort of digestible chunks. I'm sure the BBC are doing something like that. I know the Scotsman are doing something like that for tomorrow's paper as well, because I think that will probably be good for sort of the headline sort of things. But I think as well, if there's something that's particularly, if you're particularly interested in, that's the sort of the thing to focus on. So for me, for example, one of the big things for me in the election is the A9 dualling because I live on the A9. So for me, I'm like, that's the big thing for me. So I'll be wanting to look at precisely what each party is wanting to say on that, for example. Um, because yeah, you could get completely lost in things like that. And there's a lot
Just
of parties as well that are promising things that aren't costed, promising things that Scotland can't afford. And apart from the SNP, I do feel that that's because these parties know they're not going to win, but are wanting to say this is what we're going to campaign on. So, for example, the Scottish Green Manifesto, if it was all to be brought in, it would be hugely expensive, more expensive than Scotland can actually afford. And taxes would have to go up astronomically to pay for all of this. But I think it's because the Greens know that they can't get into government, but this is the things that they can push the government on a little bit. And they can push the dial a little bit more rather than actually bringing it in. So, for example, the Greens, I think, want universal free bus travel, for example. That's not going to happen. It's too expensive. But can they push what's the eligibility for free bus travel a little bit further than there is just now? Perhaps they can. And that's maybe why we're seeing their manifestos focusing on things like that.
Going back to your point there about a lot of people not knowing they can vote, why do you think that is? Is it just lack of communication from the political side of things, or
Yeah, and I
another?
think also the fact that the eligibility for Westminster is just slightly different. And I think that sort of um, immediately sort of changes people's perceptions as well, because the eligibility is slightly different. So even just things like last general elections, the big debate about voter ID and bringing an ID card to an election, that's not a thing in Scotland. So even just that little thing is just that little difference that I think people aren't understanding. But I think again, the fact that so many people don't know there's an election happening again doesn't help. The fact that some people are not interested. I'm pretty sure I heard that the Channel 4 debate viewing figures were 420,000. When you think about how many people there are in Scotland and the fact that that 420,000 is across the whole of the UK, that means there's a heck of a lot of people not watching the debates. Now, of course, we're not expecting every single voter to watch the debates, but I think that just gives you a little bit of a snapshot as to how disinterested people are in this election. There's a group of researchers at this unit called the Scottish Election Study. They're based at Edinburgh University, and they're absolutely fascinating. They've got so many interesting things that they're looking at, and they are predicting it could be the lowest turnout of any Scottish Parliament election. It could even be at the 50% or lower mark, which would be, that would be not good for anybody if that has to happen. That's not a good sort of sign to start things off with when you've got half the people who can vote not going to. So that's perhaps something that's worrying at this point in time.
sorry for a moment there, it's worth contextualizing as well. The last UK election was historically low turnout as well, right?
Yeah, I think
it's not just a Scotland issue, even though it is showing in this election.
Yeah, I think there was quite I can't remember exactly what the turnout was in 2021, but I think it was quite a reasonably high turnout. So we'll have to see how that affects the polling on polling day.
Do you feel, sort of building on Tom's question, that there's a certain lack of civic education that needs to be kept up? I mean, say for instance, the questions being asked in the debate seem to
Hmm.
show a lack of knowledge around what powers are actually devolved and which are reserved. And I kind of worry that the exact function of Scottish politics isn't really being communicated to people, or why indeed it matters, why Holyrood was built in the first place.
Yeah, I think a lot of people wouldn't be able to say this is devolved, this is reserved. I think education and health are the two big ones. I think a lot of people will know about those being devolved, but beyond that, I think it is a bit of a minefield as to what is and what isn't. So there probably needs to be a bit more awareness of that. But that's in journalism as well. I mean, there's times where I'm like, if I'm like speaking to like a national radio station rather than like a Scottish radio station, for example, and some of the questions like, no, that's not actually right. That's not actually what the Scottish Parliament does, kind of thing. So yeah, there is definitely a sort of a lack of understanding on that one. I don't really know what the answer to that is. I know
Are
that
the,
when I was
are,
at
are
school,
this
for example, like there
are the,
wasn't the education there, but then that was a long time ago. So
I, well, we had a, I mean, I went to school in Inverness, and our modern
Mhm.
studies department was fairly decent. Like we went on trips to the Scottish Parliament, but I
Oh,
mean
that's
that was
really good.
only
Yes.
that was only students who took modern studies.
Hmm.
I do know that because I did my undergraduate dissertation on engagement with Scottish politics amongst University of Edinburgh students, and I know that after the pandemic, actual physical visits to the Parliament plummeted, but they've been going down for quite a while. But in the sort of 4 years since lockdown, they've really fallen. So I don't know if it's just a question of marketing or or telling people to visit. I always try and tell people to go. Um, yeah, that's the boring politics student in me. But I was going to ask, does the Scotsman sort of do any kind of explainers on the Scottish elections, similar to the BBC's kind of how to vote and such?
Yes, that's kind of been that's kind of been my job at this election campaign. So try to think which ones I've done so far. I've done one based on how the system works and how the votes are counted. Because I think people get very confused by the fact that there's two ballot papers sometimes. And it can be a little bit confusing to explain. So I've done one on that. One on the it's called the DeHont system as well. So I've done one trying to explain what is the DeHont system. One trying to explain is who's eligible to vote, what do you do at the polling station, what do you need to bring with you to the polling station, that one as well. I'm currently working on one about the gender balance of the candidates. I think it's about 35% of candidates are female. So we're doing one for the weekend, basically looking at that kind of side of things. So we are trying to do explainers because we know that they do well. It's evergreen content that can be accessed at all points during the election. So there's not a cut off. It doesn't go out of date quickly. So we know that that's really really good. So and it also does help sort of trying to position the Scotsman as a brand in terms of its credibility, and sort of trying to make people associate the Scotsman as here's a place that I can come to find out about how things actually work as they understand what's going on. So hopefully that helps with the credibility of the brand as well.
For anyone watching this, where would they be able to find those resources? And are they behind a paywall?
I don't think those ones are behind a paywall, but yeah, if you go onto the Scotsman and go onto the politics homepage, there's a section all on the Scottish Parliament election. They should all be under that section. I can send links to them as well if that's of any help.
That'd be wonderful. We can promote them on our channels. Tom, did you have a question? I saw your mic coming off.
I did, yeah. It's just going back to like the reserved evolved question. I was just wondering, obviously you cover Holyrood closely. Is there any other big misconceptions the public holds about how Scottish politics actually works that you can dispel?
I think if people were actually to come and see what goes on behind the scenes, I think people would just be surprised at the fact that journalists and politicians are just normal, ordinary people, and they are quite nice to each other when they get out of the debating chamber, and they do talk to each other. And I think for most of the politicians there is a genuine desire to actually serve the people and all the rest of it. I think people kind of do forget about that quite a lot. I think a lot of people who, especially the ones who shout a lot about how the state of politics, if they were to actually come in and see how people work in Holyrood, I think they'd be quite surprised because it is quite a friendly atmosphere. People do talk to each other. People are quite nice to each other. parties do work together behind the scenes quite a lot. It's not this sort of factional shouting match all the time. Yes, that happens in the debating chamber, but once they leave the debating chamber, it does change completely. Obviously, there are some exceptions, of course, to that it doesn't happen across the board. That would be lovely if it could happen across the board, but it doesn't. But I think people will be surprised just how friendly people are once you sort of get behind the scenes.
So it's not always as dramatic as what you see on TV.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. It's definitely shouting and very sort of debate like when you're in the debating chamber. It kind of goes across to the committees as well, but I think once you're out and in the canteen or the coffee shop, for example, it's not like that at all, really. And I think people would be quite surprised at that.
Just a quick aside, the Scottish Parliament canteen is very good. Having having done the Festival of Politics 2 years ago, yeah, they do a good job.
Yes, there's a bit of a fight for the macaroni cheese on a Thursday, so
Oh, I can understand.
yes.
If I can go back to a point we had a couple of times ago about obviously a lot of people don't know they're eligible to vote. Do you see any particular demographic becoming unexpectedly influential in this election?
I think young people are always pointed to as potentially could be influential, but I think it really does. So I think again, because it's quite a large portion of people who, especially if they're first-time voters, we don't really necessarily know what they'll do because we don't have evidence of what they've done in the past because they haven't voted in the past. So that's quite interesting. But it depends on which group it is as to which party is going to benefit and is not going to benefit. And things are really changing a lot just now. So women, for example, we know a lot of women are leaving the SNP, mostly to go to the Greens. And women, not always, but tend to be a bit more left-wing as well, especially if they're younger women. So that's quite an interesting group to look at if you are a member of the Greens or a member of the SNP. We know that a lot of men who previously voted Conservative are moving to Reform. So it now means that a good chunk of Conservative support is actually now female, because not because the female vote has gone up, but because the male vote has gone down so much when it comes to the Conservatives. So that's quite interesting. Labour are kind of just losing votes all over the place. There's a lot of reasons for that, because Labour's support in Scotland isn't as stable as it ever was in England, because a lot of people who voted Labour in 2024 did so because they wanted to get rid of the Conservative government, not because they were loyal Labour voters. So they were never going to be reliable to stick with Labour because they'd voted SNP or they'd voted Conservative in 2021, and so it was never a loyal base for them. So the support for Labour in Scotland was always quite precarious, and we're now seeing that support drop off quite significantly. So it really depends as to which section you're in and which party you're in as to which group you're looking to be of influence here, because for some parties it's men that are going to be influential, for others it's going to be women that's influential, for others it's there is still the sort of the pro-independence unionist divide, but it's not nearly as big a divide as perhaps it was in previous Scottish Parliament elections as well.
In that sense, not necessarily demographics, but are there any sort of dark horses, any issues that the public should be paying attention to but aren't, you feel?
Ooh, that's interesting. Ooh. Well, in terms of like the priorities for voters, we know the NHS and the cost of living crisis across the whole country. That's issues 1 and 2. What is issue 3 though? What's the third most important issue? That does change across the country. So try and remember exactly which ones it was. So I think in the northeast, the west, and central Scotland, the third biggest issue is immigration. If you are in the Lothians, Edinburgh, the biggest issue is the economy. And if you're in Glasgow, the third biggest issue is poverty and inequality. And if you're in the Highlands and Islands, the third biggest issue is housing. So you can see that once you get beyond the NHS and the cost of living crisis, what is the third most important issue does differ across the country a little bit more. And I suppose that just depends on the demographic there. But it is quite interesting that things like independence, for example, oil and gas, even in the northeast, oil and gas is not necessarily as big an issue as some parties would have you believe, because I think a lot of parties are wanting to talk about oil and gas. I'm thinking that just because I spent the past few days in Aberdeen, but it's not necessarily what the voters are looking at, to be honest. So that's quite an interesting thing to look out for, as to how it changes across the country. But in
And
terms
do you
of like
think,
what stories to look out for, there's lots of things that could happen. We know the Lib Dems and the Greens in particular have got big ambitions. They could do very, very well. The Lib Dems won 4 seats at the last election. They've got their eye on 10, which would be a massive, massive improvement for them. And the Lib Dems have also been quite vocal and quite open about which seats it is they want. That's quite unusual. Quite often you'll say, oh, which seats are you targeting? And parties like, oh, we can't tell you that, and all that kind of stuff. Whereas the Lib Dems like, no, here's the 10 we're after. We were after these 10, which is quite nice to see a party being quite so clear.
they've always been quite a local party, I feel.
Exactly, and
They
that's
really
how
have
they're
their safe
really focusing on that. Exactly, they're really focusing on that. So, did you say that you were from Inverness? Is that right?
I'm technically from about 15 miles west of Inverness.
Right. Well,
But
Inverness in their own constituency, for example, that's one that they are targeting, and they're very clear that they're targeting.
I'm just
My
over the line.
okay. Whereas
No,
I'm in Berkshire
Sky
South.
Badenoch.
Sky Cavern Badenoch's also one that they're targeting too. It's also on the list of 10 for the Lib Dems. Those are going to be the sort of the Northern Highlands to be really interesting to keep an eye on to see how the Lib Dems do there. The other thing with this is the Scottish Greens. They're doing very, very well, and they're actually wanting to win their first constituency seats. They have no constituency seats, they never have one, and they think they could win 2, and that's Edinburgh Central and Glasgow Southside. The SNP's candidates for those 2 seats are government ministers, so that would be a huge upset if that was to happen. And the polling kind of looks like it might happen. So that could be really, really interesting if that happens. So that's another interesting story to keep an eye on there. The other stories, though, you'll know about, like we all know about the other stories. Can the SNP get a majority? How bad are Labour going to do? Is reform going to break through? Those are the more obvious stories, I suppose.
Just out of curiosity as well, with all the focus on reform, I feel like a lot of the attention towards the Scottish Conservatives has dipped away quite significantly. Obviously, we're past the Douglas Ross era, so have you got any predictions for where the Scottish Conservatives could go, or whether reform could spell their end?
Yeah, so I was actually in Edinburgh yesterday with Kay Badenoch yesterday. She's up in Scotland for a few days on the campaign trail. She's very confident. She believes that the party leader, Russell Finlay, can be First Minister. We know that that's not going to happen. But what's really interesting is the Scottish Conservatives, they are struggling to find relevancy. I think because those towards the right of the party are going to reform, those towards the left of the party are being attracted perhaps by the Lib Dems, by Labour, or not voting at all, for example. A lot of that has been out with the control of the Scottish Conservatives, but the Scottish Conservatives as party has kind of struggled to find their feet a little bit in the past few years. And one thing that I'm wondering is, will Russell Finlay fail to win a seat? This could happen. So he is standing in the west of Scotland, which is where he currently has a seat. Well, technically not, because Parliament's Douglas, but where he had a seat before. But that region also holds Eastwood, and that's a seat that Jackson Carlaw has as a constituency MSP. Now, if Jackson Carlaw wins that seat again, that obviously hampers the Conservatives' chances in the region. And if they do badly, there is a chance that Russell Finlay doesn't get a seat. That could happen, and I think that's something we need to keep an eye out for. And similarly, the other way around, if Jackson Carlaw doesn't get a seat, Russell Finlay will, probably. But then Jackson Carlaw probably won't pick up a regional seat, and he's a huge figure from the Conservatives and a really well-known name within the party. So you're potentially looking at 2 very big names within the party and struggling to see how both of them get in. Maybe not, but I think at this point in time, it's kind of hard to see how they both get in. I do wonder, is Russell Finlay going to struggle to get a seat?
Do you think the parties south of the border down in London are gonna pay a lot of attention to that? Because you get the feeling sometimes, say, when Anna Sarwar was calling for Keir Starmer to resign, and I think he just did today again.
Again, yes.
Yeah, but you get the feeling that Labour HQ in London doesn't really care about what's happening in the Scottish political system, or say with your party collapsing, there was a general feeling that they didn't really care about the Scottish elections. So do you think that it will be a serious warning?
Yeah, the Your Party was a strange one. Yeah, it is difficult to understand because they do sometimes feel like when the UK politicians come up to Scotland, they do sometimes misunderstand sort of the vibe, if you want to say. Like, for example, Kenny Badenoch yesterday, very, very confidently saying, yes, we can win and we can get Russell Finlay as First Minister. It's like, no, there's like literally no way that's going to happen. And for example, the last time Kenny Badenoch came up, I was asking her about sort of the single sex spaces debate, and she's like, "Oh no, it's not toxic at all. It's not toxic at all." I'm like, "Oh my god, everyone in Hollywood's tearing their hair out about it, and you're just completely ignoring that sort of point." So I think there is a bit of a misunderstanding there of Scottish politics and how it feels because they're not in Holyrood very often. When it comes to Anna Sarwar, I'm surprised that he's not doubled down on his calling for Sir Keir Starmer to resign a bit more. So, for example, the Scottish Labour conference was held the day after the Gorton Denton by-election, and at that point, this is probably why I'm not a special advisor, I'm a journalist instead. But I kind of just thought, shouldn't he at that point say, I was right, I predicted this would happen, I can see things happen before they do happen, this is why you can trust me as a leader, this is why you should vote for me. And he didn't do that. I just don't understand why, because he's burned that bridge now. That bridge isn't coming back. So just go all in at this point. And I'm not sure why he has until this morning.
Guess it's just hoping that people forget. I think that might be all the time we've got.